So I'm not actually, I don't want to downgrade or degrade what's going on in Israel, but to a certain extent, one could say that the settler colonialism in North America was really the heavyweight champion of depredations, of racist excess, and Israel will have to go a bit further to measure up to that level. At the same time, it sheds light on why U.S. imperialism has been supporting Israel, because it sees in Israel a miniature version of what it was able to accomplish in the 19th century in the face of opposition from the anti-slavery movement, from the movement concerned about indigenous dispossession, and there you have it.
All right, so let's get started. Good morning or good evening, everyone. We are here again with our favorite professor who does not need much introduction. Professor Gerald Horne of the University of Houston wrote a crazy amount of books about black radicalism, white supremacy, you name it. Professor Horne is also known as an you could say anti-racist and anti-imperialist commentator. That's how I would say it. I hope that's fine, Professor Horne. And today we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on in the world today. We were hoping to get you on because you always have a very holistic, contextual understanding of what's happening in the world today. And I thought when it comes to what's the genocide in West Asia, I thought who better to ask a couple of questions than Gerald Horne. So let's get right into it. I'm going to start with just a very broad question, because I know that the broad questions are always answered best by an historian such as yourself, Professor Horne, and that is, what is your current assessment of what is happening in West Asia? It's a very broad question. It's answered in any way you like. I'm just wondering, how do you see it? Some people will say it's an anti-colonial battle. Other people say, oh, this is ideological. You name it. This is strategic imperialism. Doesn't matter. My question to you is, Professor Horne, how do you see what is happening right now in Palestine?
Well, I guess the initial point is to suggest that the right-wing forces backing the Netanyahu government apparently are bent on expansionism. That is to say, minimally expansionism into Gaza, which would mean obviously ousting the Palestinian population from there, minimally then turning on the West Bank and expanding the settlements. The latest objective seems to be expanding into southern Lebanon. Some of the more hawkish members of his cabinet have spoken about expanding into Syria. As you know, Israel has no stated settled boundaries, despite all of the brouhaha on this side of the Atlantic about pro-Palestinian forces chanting from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free. The benighted U.S. Congress, at least certain members, have suggested that that's bigotry, but they have little or nothing to say about the fact that from the river to the sea seems to be the objective of the expansionist forces in Israel. However, obviously, they're meeting with stumbling blocks, to put it mildly. The assassinations, the murders of Palestinian leaders, Hezbollah leaders, have not stanched the resistance one whit, as evidenced by the fact that just a few days ago, you had an attack on a military base in Israel, which left in its wake dozens of casualties, including fatalities. However, I think that in the international community, the question I keep hearing as I'm monitoring global media is why is U.S. imperialism so determined to back the Israelis when it's apparent that there's a bipartisan consensus in Washington and amongst the U.S. ruling elite that China is the big enchilada, and that just as Mr. Trump, who might be sitting in the White House within months, has expressed his desire to cut a deal with Moscow so that his forces can focus like a laser beam on China. The question is, why is the United States distracting from what appears to be its overriding imperial ambition, which is to destabilize the Communist Party in China, by being bogged down in Israel? Well, first of all, you have to see the connection between the two. That is to say, that from Washington's point of view, Iran sells a good deal of its precious commodity, that is to say, petroleum, to China, and collaborating with Israel with regard to weakening the Islamic Republic, or from their point of view, best case scenario, overthrowing the Islamic Republic, would be a devastating blow in their imagination to the Chinese economy. And so, therefore, given the fact that any moment now we are expecting an attack by the Israelis on Iran, then that can be seen as consistent and congruent with the overall objective of U.S. imperialism. Although obviously there is disgruntlement at the highest levels of the U.S. ruling class about this prospect. That's how I interpret this recent leak of so-called ambitions of Israel and Iran. Although if you look at the leak, it doesn't really say anything we don't already know. The other point that I would mention, and that I have not seen mentioned by many of our friends on the left, is the fact that if you look at the history of U.S. settler colonialism, going back centuries, one of the major reasons that London, the predecessor state in this part of North America, was able to still a march on its Iberian rivals, Catholic Spain in the first place, is that Protestant London, although it had expelled its Jewish community centuries earlier, began to try to cut a deal with the Jewish diaspora as London was confronting the religious wars between itself and the Catholic powers, particularly Catholic Spain. And so from the inception of settler colonialism here in North America, and by the way, I think one of the reasons why there's inattention to this salient factor with regard to the alliance between the Jewish diaspora on the one hand and Protestant London on the other is that there's hardly any analysis, even in progressive circles, of the concept of settler colonialism as it applies to North America, although clearly that's what we're experiencing to this very day. In any case, that alliance proved decisive, I would argue, in terms of helping London to surge from behind and come to dominate North America, although Spain had occupied what is now Florida as early as 1565. And just fast forward, you may know that the man considered to be the brains of the so-called Confederate States of America, that is to say, the slave owners who sought to secede from the United States in 1861 and initiated a civil war, was a Jewish man, Judah Benjamin, with roots in Charleston, South Carolina, which was the heartbeat of the slave-owning empire of North America. And so you've had this very curious relationship between the Jewish diaspora and Washington. It manifests itself with to the speedy recognition of the Zionist state, 1947, 1948. It manifests itself in these continuing arms shipments to Israel. And I have mused in the past that it might be a form of poetic justice that the British Empire and its revolting spawn, known as the United States of America, got an initial boost from an alliance with the Jewish diaspora, proved very essential centuries previous. And now, perhaps as it's exiting center stage, it may be going over the cliff, hand in glove, with the proudest expression of the Jewish diaspora, which is the formation of the state of Israel. Because we should not downplay the peril that Israel faces as it seems on the verge of attacking Iran, about 8 or 9 times the size of Israel in population. As it hemorrhages population, there are about 40,000 U.S. nationals, many of whom carry dual passports, of course, in Israel. They're fleeing left and right. I saw a report the other day about how Cyprus now is being overrun by folk from Israel who are fleeing to that Mediterranean island. I dare say that if I were to receive a report from Malta, I would get a similar report. And so this is the state of play as we speak. And if the Israel US alliance were a stock and I were an investor, as they say on Wall Street, I would try to short that stock. That is to say, I would bet upon a precipitous decline in its value.
Mm. I've got a bunch of questions I would like to ask in follow-up, but I'll try to limit it somewhat. Maybe the first one is easier because it asks for speculation. But
Mm-hmm.
you mentioned the recent leak, and it suggests that it might be coming from some disgruntled member of the military leadership or maybe even political leadership in the U.S. I remember Colonel Larry Wilkerson weeks ago sharing a rumor basically that's been spreading around military folks about dissension within the ranks, that they're putting the brakes on some of the more adventurous plans of the U.S. in both Ukraine and Israel-Palestine. Do you think there's anything to that, or do these just remain rumors that are hard to pin down, or do you think there's something more there about dissension in the top ranks of the U.S. military?
Well, I suspect there's dissension. I mean, you need only infer from the recent revelations in the Bob Woodward book. Bob Woodward, of course, is the long-term Washington Post journalist whose new book, War, based upon the so-called background interviews with the Washington insiders. The way it works is that if you give them an interview, you come across as looking handsome and dashing. And if you don't, you come across as an ogre and a heel. And in the former category is the former chief, head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the top military man under Mr. Trump, speaking of Mark Milley, who says Mr. Trump is fascist to the core. Now, for even a retired military man to make such a statement about a man who will become president, if polls can be believed, within a few weeks or months, is quite extraordinary. But it speaks to your point concerning this growing dissension at the top levels of the U.S. ruling elite, the military elite, the national security state. It's remarkable that thus far, in talking about the stakes at play, I have not mentioned the prospect of World War III, which may be bruited by the current so-called negotiations with the Ukrainian leadership. As Mr. Zelensky puts it, either grant Ukraine membership in NATO or grant Ukraine nukes. Either proposal could be like throwing gasoline on a fire. And yet, supposedly, they're being seriously considered, although somehow I don't think so, particularly in light of the fact that Mr. Trump has made quite a to-do about pulling the plug on the Ukrainian escapade within 24 hours of entering office. And likewise, even though I mentioned China, I did not mention the Brics meeting taking place in Russia this week. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, with preliminary estimates suggesting that there will be concrete steps towards de-dollarization, perhaps, which could be one of the most significant blows administered to U.S. imperialism since the so-called Bretton Woods talks of 1944, 80 odd years ago. And so obviously, U.S. imperialism has a full plate. And there are many who are justifiably wondering, oh, why get bogged down in West Asia? And you mentioned Colonel Larry Wilkerson, the former chief of staff to late Secretary of State Colin Powell. Obviously, he has quite a bit of company in terms of what used to be called those who've come in from the cold. Speaking of former Fox News host Judge Napolitano, former CIA agents like Ray McGovern and Larry Johnson, the economist Jeffrey Sachs, who before becoming a kind of dissident was most or best known for his advice, quote unquote, to those seeking to dismantle the Soviet state in the early 1990s. And so obviously there's a lot of discontent at the highest levels of this country. And therefore, I would not dismiss these rumors and these speculative inferences by those like Colonel Wilkerson.
Mm. And just to stay in the area of Brics, how would you describe their reaction right now? I actually asked the same question to Vijay Prashad, and I asked him. I said, the Brics it has major powers from you could say the global south. The Brics is also disproportionately consists disproportionately of countries that have suffered under the yoke of colonialism, and yet, in my opinion, we have one of the worst genocides going on in modern history, and nobody's doing a thing. It seems that the whole world is just paralyzed or something. I have no idea what's going on here. I mean, I personally would expect a little bit more from China and Russia, but maybe I'm seeing things wrong. What is your assessment, Professor Horne?
Well, first, you have to look at the neighborhood. I mean, the Gulf Cooperation Council, I guess you could say, is led in a sense by Saudi Arabia. They've been meeting with the European Union of late. But the Gulf Cooperation Council, which has a lot of leverage with regard to U.S. imperialism, given the Saudis' investment in terms of U.S. Treasury bills, making loans to the U.S. government, in terms of Saudi nationals making investments in everything from Twitter to Rupert Murdoch's news enterprise, in terms of GCC members hosting U.S. military bases. And in the first instance, you would expect more from them. I've even heard that despite the invitations, MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia, won't be attending the Brics meeting. And so with regard to China and Russia, in some ways, it may be difficult to expect them, as the saying goes, to be more Catholic than the Pope. That is to say, if the neighbors, if the GCC is not raising holy hell about Lebanon and Gaza and attacks on Yemen, well, it's difficult to imagine China and Russia outstripping them. Although we all know that Russia has been involved in beefing up the air defenses of Iran. There have been reports about Russian personnel on the ground. And given the fact that Russia helping to rescue the Damascus-based regime of President al-Assad from overthrow in recent months, it would not surprise me if that Iranian case that Iranian situation were the case, that is to say, the Russians on the ground there, given the closeness between Syria and Iran. And as you know, China, they're playing their cards very close to the vest, because if you do a cold-blooded analysis, things seems to be going their way to a certain degree. That is to say, U.S. imperialism is talking at length about destabilizing the Chinese Communist Party, but yet it's bogged down in West Asia. It's unclear if they would be able to come to the defense of Taiwan, the rebel island off the southern coast of China that China claims as its own. This story that we've been hearing, which I assume will be confirmed within the next 24 to 72 hours, about the Brics moving towards some sort of digital currency and moving more concretely towards de-dollarization, plays to the strength of Beijing. And so, in a sense, you could suggest that, as the saying goes in the United States, if your opponent is digging a hole for themselves, you should not interrupt them. You should let them continue. And U.S. imperialism is digging a hole for itself. And presumably China is content to let that process continue to unfold. But having said that, we may get a reading about what we've just been talking about as soon as this week, because I dare say if there is some Israeli U.S. attack on Iran, which may be in the offing, what we've just said about the caution of China and a similar reluctance to be more directly involved by Russia, that may become inoperative, as they used to say during the Watergate days.
Mm. Yeah, I think I heard this phrase attributed to Napoleon, never interrupt your enemy while he's making a mistake. That sounds like very much what's going on in from one angle. One question I wanted to ask was something I had asked Vijay Prashad about, brought up the 50th anniversary of the new international economic order. And I asked him, is there anything like that afoot today? And he basically said, there isn't anything on that level of organization, but he referred to a new mood throughout the world's majority global South countries. What do you think about that? Do you see something a little more concrete than just a new mood, or is that an accurate descriptor, do you think, of what's going on? Countries around the world starting to at least have a feeling that the right policy would be economic independence, real sovereignty, but not yet at the stage of uniting so that those ideas or that new mood could be put into concrete practice.
Well, once again, I think we'll be able to answer that question more definitively by the end of the week when we see the final communique from the BRICS summit. Certainly, if I were a State Department, I'd be quite concerned about the BRICS summit. I'd be quite concerned about the fact that President Lula, quite famously, has been quoted for the proposition that he goes to bed every night wondering why it is that trade internationally is conducted in the US dollar. And I think that that particular sentiment is animating the summiteers in Russia this week. And likewise, taking off with what President Lula has articulated, obviously U.S. imperialism, as they say in the streets here, has a nice little hustle going. I mean, they can get French wine and cars and all manner of goods by turning over pieces of green paper. It costs hardly anything to produce. I mean, now, of course, on the other end of the equation, it's obviously unsustainable in the long run for the central bank in China, the central bank in Japan to keep buying these US Treasury bills, for example. And of course, indications are they've been cutting their purchases in the last 12 to 24 months. But I think that this is going to be an elongated process, disengaging from the snares of US imperialism. It reminds me of the most recent quote from Mr. Trump, where he says that Xi Jinping thinks I'm crazy. And so therefore that gives him leverage against China. And the sad part of it is A, Mr. Trump might be crazy, and B, this idea of posing as crazy, as you may know, goes back at least to Nixon during the war in Vietnam, where he had the so-called crazy man theory. He wanted to appear to be crazy to the Vietnamese so that they would accept the possibility that he would use nuclear weapons and blow up the world in order to prevent a US defeat. And so, given that kind of dynamic, I understand why the Brics Summiteers and those forces who would like to see a change in the status quo are proceeding cautiously and step by step, because you may be dealing with madmen on this side of the Pacific. And it reminds me of the story. Well, actually, I won't repeat this. Well, I'll repeat it anyway. I don't know what your field is. I mean, you know the story about how the U.S. novelist Ernest Hemingway died?
No, not well.
Okay, so apparently, I assume this is true because I keep reading it, that he committed suicide because as he was getting older, he was losing his potency, and he didn't feel that life was worth living in that state. And to analogize to U.S. imperialism, there is a kind of comfort on Wall Street and in Washington about being the top dog of the world. And like Hemingway, they may decide that life is not worth living unless you're the top dog. And so Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa are understandably proceeding cautiously.
Mm.
Yeah, so talking about top dog, I'm gonna shift gears a bit back to the whole situation in West Asia and the West. So I always ask this question to pretty much all our guests, and that is, what, according to you, explains this total unwavering support by Western European nations for a blatant genocide? I mean, it is now on our screens for more than a year. This utter evil. Everyone can see it. And yet they don't seem to be moved. Anyone all over the West, they even beat up their own populations, politicians, because you're not allowed to resist a genocide. So what explains this almost desperate clinging on to such a genocidal state? Some would say, oh, it's ideological. Others would say it's guilt. Others would say it's strategic thinking. There are so many reasons, but it's almost incomprehensible to it's just incomprehensible, this extreme support. What from your perspective, Professor Horne, what would explain this support for this utter evil?
Well, first of all, Europe is fragmented, as we know. I mean, Germany has been a major supplier of armaments to Israel. In terms of the guilt factor, perhaps you can factor that into Berlin's equation. Although back during the days of the Cold War, there used to be this talk about the so-called satellites of Moscow, where you can speak of many of the European nations as being satellites of U.S. imperialism, particularly mighty powers like the Federal Republic of Germany. On the other hand, if you look at French policy, for example, Mr. Macron of late has called for an arms embargo, followed by Prime Minister Meloni in Italy. There's been dissent in Oslo, Madrid, and Dublin as well with regard to EU policies. And then, of course, if you look at the European Union itself, imagine, if you will, that in the United States of America, California had its own foreign policy, Texas had its own foreign policy. Indirectly, they do, but constitutionally and legally, foreign policy of this so-called republic is supposed to be executed through the U.S. State Department. And generally speaking, that is the case. Now, of course, we know that Mr. Trump, during his tenure, was considering a criminal prosecution of former presidential contender John Kerry for having talks with the Iranians about the nuclear deal. There's been a lot of talk, for example, particularly in the Woodward book, about Mr. Trump having his own foreign policy when it comes to Moscow. But those blips aside, U.S. foreign policy, generally speaking, is cohesive insofar as it's executed through Washington and the State Department. The the EU foreign policy maven, Mr. Burrell, I mean, first of all, he's like Biden. He's like a gaff machine, for example, in terms of his loose talk about the European Union being a kind of garden and the rest of the world being a jungle. Win friends and influence people in the international community. And his weaknesses ideologically and politically aside, it's clear that structurally EU member states can go off on their own when it comes to foreign policy, which is why you have this divergence with regard to Israel. But it reminds me, in a sense, of a critique that I have been thinking about with regard to some of our Arab friends. I just made reference to the Gulf Cooperation Council, for example, and their lethargy in confronting Israel, because it seems to me that if the neighbors are not energetic in confronting Israel, we should ask why those outside of the neighborhood should be more energetic than the neighbors. But to a degree, I don't think, and I say this by looking at some of our Arab American friends. I've probably told you the story more than once about how at a pro-Palestinian rally a few years ago in Texas, how I was reprimanded by some of the Arab Americans, and I assume Arabs present, who did not like the idea of my referring to the United States as a settler colonial regime. And so I just found out something else in that regard, that the newest in-law of Mr. Trump is a Lebanese billionaire who has made his fortune in Nigeria. And what's happened historically is that North Atlantic imperialism has cut a deal with certain Arab forces for them to be compradors, be it in Nigeria, be it in West Africa generally, in Haiti, for example. The richest man in Mexico, Carlos Slim, is Lebanese, or of Lebanese origin, I should say. And then, of course, in the United States of America, those who have been allowed to enter the hallowed halls of whiteness include not only folks from Lebanon, but Egyptian Christians, for example. And so I'm not sure if there's been altogether a kind of honesty or inventory, if you like, of the relationship of the Arab community, the Arab American community, to North Atlantic imperialism. And I think if you were to do such an inventory, you'd come to an easy conclusion as to why there has been such lethargy with regard to this unfolding live stream genocide that's taking place in Gaza, now in Lebanon. Who knows what's next? And I really encourage our Arab and Arab American friends to do such an inventory.
Yeah, very good point. And we actually talked about that during one of our discussions with Laith Marouf about the fact that there's this weird combination of the comprador class who also internalize white supremacy in a way. Often they are right-wing extremist Christians, for example, in Lebanon, and that's really something that needs to be discussed in Arab communities as well. This weird kind of white supremacy that you see there too, which is very much connected to that kind of internalization of the empire's values. You could say, you know what I mean? They're when you say that, like these Arab Americans who consider themselves white. Yeah, I'm not surprised. I mean, you have the same problem not only in American communities, you have the same problem in Turkey. There are atheist Turks who feel that they have more in common with the West, and they also actually feel that they are more white than Middle Eastern. So it's a very powerful thing, the way U.S. imperialism psychologically also indoctrinates people with racism and a need to be part of that group that is actually just very, very oppressive. Anyway, Peter, you wanted to ask
But
something?
2 points. 2 points. One is that some of our Arab and Arab American friends may be in a position analogous to that of Saddam Hussein in 1990, 1991, when he made his intervention in Kuwait. And he had thought that given the dynamics of the pre-existing Cold War, that Moscow would intervene on his side. But there was the Gorbachev leadership, which was leading the Soviet Union in a different direction. And therefore, he was left out on a limb and suffered an ignominious defeat because he did not necessarily grasp the rapidly changing international dynamics. And likewise, those who are staking their future on whiteness and white supremacy, as I said, they may be betting on a losing horse, so to speak. I mean, in other words, they're betting on white supremacy as it seems to be in decline with the rise of China in particular. And of course, a footnote here, according to press reports, the border dispute between China and India seems to be moving towards some sort of resolution, and which will hasten the day, if that proves to be accurate, that these North Atlantic powers, the so-called West, accelerates its precipitous decline. And then the other point, of course, is that, as I said, the Jewish diaspora, with regard to the top dogs, speaking of London, then Washington, was in on the ground floor in terms of their ascension at a time, of course, when you had the Western Europeans shrinking at the prospect of being invaded by the Arabs. I mean, as you know, Spain only ousted altogether Arab and Muslim rule in that hinge year of 1492. It's almost like an accident of history that France, in the 9th century, was able to escape a similar fate. And so, even though some of our Arab friends might not recall this history, I guarantee you that it's buried deep in the recesses of the brains of these North Atlanticists who still feel they have a bone to pick with many in the Arab and Arab American community. And in any case, as I said, the Jewish diaspora stole a march on them by cutting this deal with London as early as the 16th century. So once again, may we live in interesting times, because all of these trends seem to be coming to a head as we speak.
Speaking of living in interesting times, I couldn't help but ask a question about the U.S. election, because I'm teaching a class on U.S. politics, and my students are from here, and so they're quite interested in the election. I try to tell them, personnel is policy. One thing to look at are the top advisors to each candidate. I found there was an article, I think, in Foreign Affairs a while back about Trump's foreign policy advisors. I haven't been able to find something similar about Harris. What's your view on just the likely foreign policy of either a second Trump administration or a Kamala Harris administration, to the extent that that is even discernible at this point?
Well, the reason I'm chuckling, I follow Caroline Glick, who is this Israeli hawk. I follow her so you don't have to, because I don't necessarily recommend wasting your time listening to this hawk. But she was just mentioning in an interview the other day that Phil Garton, who is the top national security advisor to Vice President Harris, would probably be the equivalent of Jake Sullivan, and that is to say, the national security advisor in an incoming Harris regime. She says that he is now under investigation for his ties to the Iranians. As a matter of fact, she was charging that there are a number of forces at the assistant secretary level at the Pentagon who are similarly under investigation because of ties to Iran. Now, I haven't read that anywhere. I just heard it from her, but she's very well connected to the hawkish forces in Washington, who, of course, are tied to the Zionist lobby, who, as you know, wield maximum influence in the United States of America. And so what this brings me to is the statement that's attributed to my old friend, presidential candidate Cornel West, who says that if you vote for the Republicans, you're voting for civil war. If you're voting for the Democrats, you're voting for World War III. And interestingly, I think that, in fairness, a number of progressive forces, they're, in a sense, voting for World War III, but I assume that their calculation in voting for Harris is that the social and economic forces that are backing Harris, many unions, the Black community, et cetera, will somehow be able to rise up and stay the hand of World War III. I'm not sure if that's a good bet, but I'm not even sure if they realize that that's their calculation, which is even more stunning and dangerous. But certainly you are correct to point to what the Republicans calculate and tally as being the 5,000 appointees that an incoming president can make, including the highest levels of the Pentagon, the State Department, U.S. embassies overseas, not to mention all of the domestic agencies. And I just looked at a poll from The Economist, which, the British weekly, which actually poses as a British weekly. It's really more like a U.S. neocon weekly. Mm-hmm. But in any case, it had been publishing a number of articles in recent weeks quite critical of the Trump phenomenon, but their latest poll, which I find hard to believe, shows him up by 9 points in this election. I find it hard to believe, because most commentators, even if they say that Mr. Trump might prevail, it'll be through this arcane electoral college where you lose the popular vote, but you win in the electoral college, which is what he did in 2016. And to think that he's up in terms of the popular vote, I find hard to believe. On the other hand, I've thought for a long time that since neither candidate had reached 50% in terms of the polls, and in light of the fact that a significant percentage of those being polled saying that they haven't made a determination. Well, I don't accept that. I think that a lot of those being polled who say that they haven't made a determination, I think they're really closet Trump voters. They just don't want to admit it to the pollsters, perhaps even to themselves. And everybody knows that even if Mr. Trump is determined to have lost in both the electoral college and the popular vote, he's going to cry fraud. And even though some of the pundits tell us that we can rest easy in terms of a replay of January 6, 2021, you had an insurrection to overturn the peaceful transfer of power. I'm not so sure about that kind of calculation. So my suggestion to your students is for them, if they're serious about U.S. politics, to buckle their seatbelts.
Sorry, just follow-up question real quick. Was that an internal poll of economist readers, in which case the results make sense, or is that a poll of likely voters throughout the U.S.?
I think it was the latter, although I just saw the headline just before I came on camera. So I can't say definitively.
Mm.
Yeah, so I have one final question, Professor Horne, and that is about more of what we are seeing here happening in West Asia, and with regards to its uniqueness or not. And you, as a historian, probably are best suited to give an answer to this question. What we are seeing right now happening on our phones is one of the most depraved, evil things I think most of us have ever seen. Beheaded children, burning people, videotaped rape, you name it. Absolutely horrible. Many people are also saying this is unique. This is one of the most evil thing that happened in history. Some would even say that it goes beyond what Nazi Germany did. My question to you is, with a lot of knowledge of colonialism, is this unique, this utter depravity, or is this finally a window into what the Western Empire has always been?
Well, I think it's more the latter. That is to say, I'm sitting here in the state of Texas. And as you know, I wrote a book a year or so ago that has as a subtitle, The Roots of U.S. Fascism. And what was remarkable about the depredations inflicted upon the Comanches and the Apaches and the indigenous peoples of this part of North America is that what happened was that Washington wanted to place the indigenous on reservations, which is ultimately what's happened. But the settlers wanted to see them liquidated. And fundamentally, the settlers went out. And that's what's consistent with Israel, because many of our commentators and pundits are telling us right now that the bloodlust in Israel right now, with regard to anti-Palestinian fervor, is off the charts. For example, that with these targeted assassinations that Mr. Netanyahu has resumed being more popular than he was on October 7th, 2023. He might even be able to prevail in another election. And to that extent, it reminds me of North American settler colonialism, for example, whereby there was a kind of right-wing populism. And you can, of course, see that with regard to the Trump phenomenon, just like you can see it in Israel. That is to say, this kind of settler colonialism on both sides of the Atlantic is grounded in no small measure in a kind of class collaborationism, which suggests that those defined as, quote, white, unquote, who are part of the working class or backing neo-fascism, for example, which is nothing new. Many of them, as I said, were backing liquidation of the Native Americans in the 19th century. And you see this sort of class collaborationism on January 6, 2021, You saw it illustrated because, of course, those who assaulted the Capitol included CEOs flying in on private jets, shopkeepers, declassed elements, military veterans, Teamsters, etc. You see it reflected in the recent abortive longshore strike on the East Coast of the United States. The union, the International Longshore Association, is notorious for its ties to organized crime, which has been a hallmark of right-wing populism. That particularly goes for its leader, the elderly Harold Daggett, a close comrade of Mr. Trump. When it seemed as if the strike were going to take flight a few weeks ago, Mr. Trump's favorite newspaper, the New York Post, had on the front page a picture of Mr. Daggett's palatial mansion in New Jersey. Parked in the driveway was a Bentley. Ask some of your friends in Hong Kong what a Bentley is, for example. And so this kind of so-called working class leadership is part and parcel of the right-wing populism that has been a kind of ruling ideology, uniting settlers across class lines here in North America, and you see a similar phenomenon in Israel. And so the short answer to your question is that what's unique about the current moment is that it's being live streamed. What happened in Texas in the middle of the 19th century obviously wasn't live streamed. You can only read accounts about it, for example. You can only read accounts, for example. I'm writing a book as we speak about slavery in Washington, D.C. And what's remarkable there, among other things, is the breeding of Africans, like you would breed cattle or bulls, for example. Not to mention the fact that just as you have Mr. Musk, who is trying to conduct a one-man campaign against what he considers to be population decline, or Pavel Durov, Telegram fame, supposedly he's made scores of sperm donations in recent years. Well, you had U.S. leaders who were doing the same thing with women of African descent, for example. I cannot begin to tell you about the number of people who are defined as Black who are carrying the genes of many of the founders and many of the eminent personalities of this so-called republic. And so I'm not actually, I don't want to downgrade or degrade what's going on in Israel, but to a certain extent, one could say that the settler colonialism in North America was really the heavyweight champion of depredations, of racist excess. And Israel will have to go a bit further to measure up to that level. At the same time, it sheds light on why U.S. imperialism has been supporting Israel, because it sees in Israel a miniature version of what it was able to accomplish in the 19th century in the face of opposition from the anti-slavery movement, from the movement concerned about indigenous dispossession. And there you have it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, even the last time the U.S. government was co-perpetrating a genocide in Guatemala, a lot of the same themes or continuities prevailed, like, different form of settler colonialism, the Spanish variant, but still, the support was pretty ironclad, and there was no videos of it. There was no, internet to actually see what was going on a daily basis. And it shows today that you can even have that. And yes, public opinion does show, much less support for U.S. government policy in Palestine than U.S. government policy towards Guatemala in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But it is somewhat depressing that even with, so much more coverage, more exposure, public opinion has shown itself to be, an irrelevant force thus far.
Well, it also reminds me of one of my pet peeves nowadays, which is the role of these sons of apartheid in U.S. political and economic culture. Not only Elon Musk, of course, born in South Africa, not only Peter Thiel, the early supporter of Mr. Trump, an early funder of J.D. Vance, his uh, vice presidential nominee, who, of course, spent a good deal of his youth in Southern Africa, in his case, in the former German colony of Namibia, where the first genocide of the 20th century took place, uh, visited upon the Nama people, but also Roelof Botha, who was a titan of venture capital in Silicon Valley. And that name might ring a bell because the original Roelof Botha, of course, was a leader of the apartheid regime during his dying days. And I find it remarkable that these men have been able to seamlessly inject themselves into this U.S. culture. And I'm quite critical of many of our friends in the Black community who have not made a bigger stink about this, uh, particularly in light of the fact that Mr. Musk, in particular, you can't pick up a newspaper nowadays without reading about his outrages.
Mm-hmm. Well, we are at an hour, although we have technically 2 or 3 more minutes. So if there are any last reflections, thoughts, or perhaps turning our attention to developments that are not receiving much attention, but you think they should be receiving more, anything you'd like to say?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, I have to say I'm following events in the Horn of Africa very closely. It's a developing alliance against Ethiopia, spearheaded by Egypt, which is suggesting that Ethiopia, by building the Grand Renaissance Dam, is threatening its lifeblood, speaking of the Nile. The Somali regime upset with Ethiopia for recognizing the breakaway province of Somaliland, since it wanted a seaport. And of course, Eritrea, which broke away from Ethiopia to declare independence. The three leaders, Somalia, Eritrea, and Ethiopia, and Egypt, and now formed a kind of alliance. They may be backed by Turkey, which is the power behind the throne in Somalia, doing everything from picking up the garbage to providing airline security. The biggest hospital in Mogadishu is named after President Erdogan, for example, suggestive of Turkey's influence in that part of Africa. And not only in that part of Africa, but of course, despite all of the focus on the real and imagined Chinese role in Africa, actually, if you look at malign purposes, you should look more closely at what Turkey is doing, what the United Arab Emirates is doing, particularly in the Sudan, for example. The fact that the leader of the UAE was meeting in the White House with Mr. Biden just a few days ago, I think is quite ominous, particularly to come full circle in light of the eerie silence of many of the members of the Gulf Cooperation Council, including the UAE, which is rumored to be a transmission belt helping to bail out the Israeli economy, for example. This visit of MBZ to the Oval Office should have gotten more attention, but once again, we're paying a very stiff and heavy price in this country because of the inattention to global developments as this small planet teeters on the brink of World War III.
Well said.
Yeah, and just one small thing. I think that is very interesting what you talk about. I've heard also quite a few Arabic people complain about imperialism in Africa by the UAE and other parts of West Asia. And I think this is such an important aspect that is not spoken about a lot, to be very honest. I mean, you're talking about Turkish imperialism, very simply put, and you're talking about Gulf state imperialism, and probably, of course, in cahoots with Western imperialism in Africa. So I think that would be such an interesting talk as well, to go more deeper into that kind of imperialism and what's going on in Africa. So I hope we can ask you that in the future when we hopefully have another hour. But for now, I guess we can end it here. Great talk, and great seeing you again, Professor Horne.
Ditto.
And hopefully we can bother you again to go more deeper into the whole Gulf state imperialism in Africa.
Of course, of course.
Excellent. Well, thank you again so much for your time. It was great chatting with you.
Ditto. Good luck to you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we will send you the link.
Oh, good. Great. Glad to hear it.
All right. Have a good day.
Bye. All right.
Oh man, that was again excellent. It's always so easy, and it doesn't matter which question you ask. Every question he replies like he reads it. But it's impossible because our question jump from topic to topic. It's impossible that he has that in front of him.
Yeah, no, he definitely does a hell of a lot of reading. Like, I really think it's a great idea to read right-wingers as he does, just to see what's going on in their world. Yeah.
I can't handle it, man. I can't handle it. Like, I can do it from time to time, but in case of Gerald Horne, I find it impressive because Gerald Horne is reading stuff that dehumanizes him personally.
Yeah.
And I think if you're a white leftist, it's easier to do because at least you can distance yourself a bit from the stigmatization and victimization. But if I read that there's so much anger and frustration and rage coming into me, I either start replying with very aggressive comments or they just fuck up my day. So I'm just not doing it, even though I can do it when it's, for example, when it's about right-wingers talking about right-wingers being anti-Semitic. So you have a lot of right-wingers now blaming the Jews for what is happening in Palestine. And I can't stand that because it's just fucking racism.
Yeah.
And I'm still very much triggered to reply like, it's not about the fucking Jews, dude. It's about the Zionists. But at least I can distance myself a little bit more from that. But the moment they start talking about Arab immigrants or North Africans or whatever, or fucking Muslims, and this, even though I'm not a Muslim, but it's just it because it's the things they say are so besides the truth. But they are so caught up in their own memes that are circulated among them that their hatred for Muslims is real. Like, I've seen people in the Netherlands, so many people really hating Muslims and Arabs, which is, it's such a waste because it's all based on total lies. Like, guys, if you would know, you would actually probably have a lot of fun with the Arab community, but they're so caught up in that circulation of lies that they're just enraged by shit that's not true.
Yeah. No, it's exactly how it is. Your media bubble, your information diet, if it is predominantly right-wing sources, you live in on a different planet. And you don't, like, you mentioned we see the genocide on our screens. They don't see the genocide in their screens. On their Twitter feed, it's a completely different picture. In their TV diet, totally fucking different picture. None of those scenes are there. Instead, they have all these stories about, how any bombing that happened, it was actually just hitting a military target, and all the talk about civilian casualties are lies. And, they're just on this other planet. And that's why I think, the media is so important. You've got to get through and break through these little information bubbles. But it's so said than done.
Yeah, exactly. And it also explains it's a lot of these guys. I saw some videos in Britain. It also explains their friggin' rage towards anti-genocide protesters. Like, you see these young British white guys just going all rage on like old ladies who are holding a sign, please help the victims of Palestine. and just going completely nuts, wanting to beat her up, man. Fucking terrorist, you fucking bloody terrorist. And I'm like, it's painful to see. It's deeply pathetic, but it's unfortunately very, very dangerous.
Exactly. No, as a fan of the human race, it's extremely depressing to see so much potential squandered.
Extremely, Peter, and it brings us back to that age-old discussion that we talked about on this channel, and that is that we need to get rid of the Western dominance of the media in all over the world. It's destroying the world. It's the only reason for the media there. It's not just to propagandize for imperialism, but that propaganda is in itself made to divide populations all over the world. So they have shit societies. You have it in Lebanon, you have it in Iran, you have it in Turkey, you have it in Saudi Arabia. These are all these channels that divide people based on sectarian grounds, based on racial/ethnic grounds. And they just literally are there to mess up a world that could be much more beautiful if these fuckers were just not there on our television, man, and on our social media.
Exactly. Media is God, and it's a really nasty God. It's more like a demon right now, the way it's set up. I mean, that's the whole new international information order idea was a fucking great idea, and it would be great to see that resurrected.
Absolutely, man. Absolutely.